Good morning, everybody. My name is Rockie Brockway, and thank you for coming. This is a really competitive time slot, and there's a lot of other really interesting talks as well. So thanks for coming out here. I work for Black Box Network Services. If you are at all familiar with them, you should probably remember the old catalog that was giant and sold lots of cables and things of that nature. I'm the Information Security and Business Risk Director for Black Box, and for me, the geek started really early. I'm not really going to go back and do much of my background. I've been in information security for 23 years now, I believe. I got a really lucky start, though. My senior project, I went to Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, and my senior project ended up being working for this organization that was founded by a guy named Dr. Peter Tippett. And he's, I guess, widely credited as having written the first antivirus program. So he had this little startup company in Shaker Heights, which is one of the suburbs of Cleveland. And I got an opportunity to intern for him, disassembling virus code and figuring out what they did and essentially designing assembly little widgets and programs to remove and clean viruses. I worked there for maybe a year and a half out of college. And they got acquired by Symantec, so a lot of our stuff actually ended up being migrated into Norton Antivirus. So that was kind of my lucky first start. Some advisor said, "Hey, this guy is doing some interesting stuff in computer security. You should check it out." And I was like, "Oh, okay, great." But I also am one of the co-organizers of B-Sides Cleveland. I've run my own company I ran my own company for close to a decade doing penetration testing, threat assessment, risk analysis. And so having said all of that, disclaimer A, standard stuff, nothing I say represents any of the people that I have worked for or work for currently. Disclaimer B, this isn't a technical talk, this isn't a box popper talk. It's focused on natural security systems. It is absolutely not about Darwinian evolution versus religion. We're talking about adaptive systems, and I fully expect arguments and welcome them, absolutely. I want to start with some generic problems within InfoSec, all right? Security is viewed as a tactical IT function, and that ends up being a reactive type system. If you speak at a very high business level or layer within your organization and ask them about security, they're going to probably end up saying something along the lines of, what firewalls have you installed lately? And that's not really beneficial to the business, because we really need to kind of reset this mindset and accept that security is a function of the business, right? And rational. This quote from Edward Deming, who is a kind of an older business analyst: rational behavior requires theory, reactive behavior requires only reflex action. We're kind of living that right now in terms of, and I'll kind of hit on it in a little bit, but in terms of the way we are reacting to, especially all of this giant media frenzy of big breaches, APTs, and all that, right? Our organizations are reacting to those things as opposed to kind of rationally thinking about what's our business risk, what's the business need. And so this talk really is going to focus around how can we as organizations kind of behave and adapt accordingly to this kind of evolving threat landscape. So real quickly, and this is my opinion, our role really is to prevent the loss of business critical data. And one of the biggest things in understanding business critical data is having the conversations at those business leader levels to really get a grasp of what is important to the business. What is your business critical data? What are the systems that your organization relies upon for their success? Where do you think that business critical data lives, right? That's always a really interesting question when you're talking to, let's say, a CIO or CEO. Where does your business critical data live? Well, my IT guys can probably answer that, but it's something that is kind of a foggy mystery to the majority of the organizations that we deal with on a daily basis at a business decision leader level. Promoting innovation and allowing businesses to take risk, right? So we're in the business of reducing and or mitigating risk to the point where it's acceptable to whatever organization's posture, right? So the irony is that in reality, we're reducing risk so that organizations can take more risk, because without taking risk, business and organizations they don't innovate, right? And that's where success comes from. That's where business market leadership comes from, being able to innovate and take all that risk and protecting the brand, right? So the problems then are understanding these things, right? What are the initiatives? What are the goals? What is that business critical data? Who else might find value in that data? That's a key variable that I don't see talked about very often when we're talking about analyzing the risk to an organization, right? Who else might find value in that data? What are their capabilities? How much would they be willing to spend to get that business critical data, your business critical data that they find valuable? How much would they invest in that? Is there a clear ROI? If we can, for the adversary, right? If we can design systems with that understanding of their capabilities to the point that there's no real clear ROI, then that's kind of a win. We're no longer low-hanging fruit, right? So this is the standard FUD slide. There's lots of bad things that are going on. We'll just move on. So as a reaction, the reactionary result is businesses are buying a lot of products that are geared towards preventing this latest attack or improving these sets of processes because of this enhanced feature and it's faster or more, whatever. And several other things. Legislation, I'm not going to really touch into, but there's a point that I do want to make on that, is that if you get to the point where a problem becomes so big that you need to try to legislate it, like SOPA or any other latest attempts, you've really missed what was wrong to begin with, and so that's a problem. The irony here is that this business and our feeding, because of our reactionary, our reaction to these threats and media frenzy, is creating an entirely larger, even more giant industry of those product solutions. So we are part of the problem. What does this talk actually attempt to solve? Well, these two slides here are one from Gartner, one from the Verizon DBIR, and I know I said Verizon DBIR, and I don't have a shot, but I apologize. But it essentially illustrates this, right? The IT spend has roughly been increasing over time for the last 5 years, and for the most part, the breaches have been increasing over the last 5 years. So we're spending more money on these controls, yet there doesn't seem to be a lot of tangible actual results. So in my opinion, we're probably investing our security dollar in the wrong areas. And yeah, if you take a look at people like a David Kennedy or somebody who is really kind of on the cutting edge of security research, right? Even he will tell you that from a security technology perspective, we're probably at least 2 years behind the advancement of where today's malware, professional business-driven malware really are. They're a couple of years ahead of us already, and we're, unfortunately, that puts us in that position of reacting even further. So the problems here, the second problem here is we have this obsession with static models, right? The problem with walls. If you have a wall that, standard, it's a static control, at some point, water is going to eventually be able to get around it, right? It's not an adaptive control. And the unfortunate reality is that our reliance on these types of static controls have we've dug our own hole to a degree, and we really need to kind of figure out how to get out of that. So organizational entropy as the third part of this talk. I really love this term. It's really, really elegant because it's essentially organizational entropy is a natural result of assuming you're smarter than your adversaries. And let's face it, right? Especially American corporations, there's a kind of a large ego in terms of here's how we do things, here's the way things are done. Other companies, here's the way things are done, and because of that kind of inherent that inherent entropy, right, we're falling down into this constant of business as usual. And if we're in this state of business as usual, and especially, here's a contrary point, right? A lot of our organizations right now are very profitable. So there's not a lot of incentive to change that. So how can we also, and this is one of the big points here, how can we successfully kind of change the way our organizations are reacting, right? We don't want that. We want this kind of rational thought. How can we organically change that in such a way that it doesn't directly affect the business revenue bottom line, because that's successful and there's no incentive to change that, right? However, that business as usual mentality is directly related to our reliance on static controls and yielding very large breaches right now that are saturating our media. The last one here is the current unnatural state of our business organizations, and I just kind of talked through that. But yeah, this business as usual mentality has resulted in this entropy, and the organizations are not being creative enough to think of ways to begin adapting to these more advanced threats coming our way, unfortunately reacting and buying more blinky lights. So these are the four issues that I want to try to discuss through here. And again, can we actually change that successful gross profit driven business model without telling that whole C-suite that they're doing things wrong? That's the question I pose, and this is what I feel. I feel that yes, we can. Nobody? All right. So here's my posit, right? Naturally adaptive systems are inherently more secure. Okay. And from here in this talk, I'm going to start kind of breaking down some of the ways that in nature organisms adapt, and there are several very concrete ways that this is done within the animal kingdom, so to speak. And how can we apply that? How can we apply that to our business organizations? Because organisms are kind of very similar to organizations. They're small parts, and they cooperate or compete with other parts within here, and because of that, there's cooperation that can grow, and naturally over time, by kind of learning from not our failures but actually our successes. I'll kind of get into that as well. We begin to naturally build more secure natural systems. A couple of or three inspiration / sources. If nobody's familiar with these books, please take a picture. They're fantastic. Emergence by Stephen Johnson, The Connected Lives of Ants, Brains, Cities, and Software. The Wisdom of Crowds by James Rockie is a fantastic book about how the collective reasoning of large groups of very dissimilar backgrounds and intellects when given a challenge, will eventually lead to the best solution. And then learning from the octopus is essentially, and I'm going to steal a bunch from this guy as well, who wrote this book, but he really took it to a next level. The guy that wrote that book is a biologist who then went into support, I believe, a senator and from a national security perspective. But he's got these really interesting, he's got a great, interesting biological background, and applying this to how we, to how our organizations kind of, move forward, and has a lot of really interesting ideas. So, general rules, okay, for systems that are naturally adaptable and therefore inherently more secure, right? Decentralization is a giant variable here. The concept of learning from your failure in nature doesn't actually get you anywhere, right? In nature, if you fail at survival, that's kind of the end of the road, right? Learning from your successes is actually more natural and more reasonable, right? I was able to escape this here, and I was able to find food here, etc. So learning from those successes is actually, in nature, way more important than learning from your failures. Information usage to mitigate uncertainty. I'll dive into that one, but in information security, uncertainty plays a gigantic role in both offense as well as defense, and I'll touch on that. And then symbiotic partnerships, right? So the bottom line here, though, is that successfully naturally adaptive systems do not, they don't predict things, they don't plan things out. There are no edicts to do this, X, Y, Z. So the first point here in being able to kind of understand where we actually sit within this, within this whole kind of naturally adaptive system is this point, right? Adaptation arises from leaving or being forced from your comfort zone, okay? So that really kind of ties into, I would say maybe indirectly, but this reactive mentality that we have of, oh, here's a big threat, and here's this thing that somebody is saying, buy this from us, and that will mitigate this big threat. That's not really leaving your comfort zone. That's just, well, here's some money. So when we talk and move on, this concept, there are going to be four techniques, so to speak, that are details of successful adaptation. Decentralization is the first one, right? So multiple sensors, and I'll just pull this out, right? Here are the benefits of decentralized and distributed organizational systems, right? You've got multiple sensors, no preconceived notions, specialized tasks, and redundancy. So multiple sensors, all right? Well, a friend of mine gave a really good talk maybe a year or so ago about security awareness. And one of the things that he touched upon in security awareness training programs and whatnot is that if you have, I would much rather have an entire organization full of individually educated and aware persons within my organization rather than relying on a firewall, okay? So having multiple sensors within your organization or within your, let's call it, group of organizational variables is very, very important. No preconceived notions, right? Having no preconceived notions is essentially nobody's saying to anybody within the organization, this is what needs to be done, or this device here needs to be configured this way. What happens is, and I'll touch upon this in a little bit more detail, is that the requirement of a challenge within an organization or an organism, right, either one, challenges end up being one of those little sparks that then can multiple parts of the organization can then say, hey, we have this challenge that we need to solve. Let's think about this. Let's collaborate. Let's see if we can collectively find the best way to solve this challenge. And in nature, that's huge. And I'll get into that in a little, in a couple more minutes in more detail. I think I just backed up on that one. Hold on. There we go. Specialized tasks, right? So they're within any organism slash organization, there are elements that do specific things, and then redundancy. And obviously, in information security, we all understand the importance of redundancy. So the second here, and this again, this is a very important point. The second very important point within this talk is that in order to be successfully adaptive, naturally, you need a challenge, right? There must be some type of challenge to initiate, competition, cooperation, etc. Some examples, obviously, from both the animal kingdom as well as technology are here. Does anybody, finding a lost nuclear submarine, does anybody know what the USS Scorpion is? Anyone? Nobody? One person? Do you recall what that is? Exactly. All right. So the Scorpion was the only nuclear submarine the United States has ever lost, and I believe it was 68. So really interesting analogy, and this actually came from Sir Rockie's book, Wisdom of Crowds. He talks about how they kind of went about kind of determining where they think that sub went down, right? So they had the last radio transmission. They had roughly the area of the last location of the last transmission. They had wind direction, current direction and all that. The director of the Navy at the time, and I forget his name, issued a challenge to everybody within the Navy, or maybe, an area of the Navy, but that included generals, that included custodians, right? So a very wide sample set of people to kind of, present this challenge to. And the challenge was, in your estimation, give me your best approximation of where you think this sub is. And so not any one of those answers were anywhere near correct when they actually found where the sub went down. But the mean of these hundreds of answers ended up being 224 yards away from the actual location of the sub on the bottom of the sea. That's the wisdom of crowds. That's mind-blowing. That's fantastic. So challenges within any organization are a very critical key component, right? No edicts, challenges. And from a managerial perspective, I hope if it's not already in your repertoire, I hope that this starts to kind of sink in. The third technique here, information sharing, filtering, and prioritization, right? So obviously, we in information security, we understand about the sharing of information, the filtering of information, both from an offensive perspective as well as a defensive perspective, and prioritization of that information, right? Prioritization leads directly into access control systems. Who's allowed to, access this type of data, or this data should be considered more important in transmission over the wire, etc. But at the bottom line here, right? Organisms seek to reduce uncertainty for themselves and increase uncertainty for their adversaries, right? Hi, information security, right? That's absolutely what we as InfoSec and risk professionals really are focusing on, right? Honeypots, to kind of sleight of hand any type of potential adversary, reduce the, generating uncertainty for a potential attacker that then will give you, let's say, more ample time to detect and react to that particular threat, right? So uncertainty is giant in terms of, when we're talking about information itself and utilizing that information accordingly. The last one here from a successful adaptation technique is symbiosis, right? There's a number of different types of symbiosis. according to, the experts, mutualistic, commensal, parasitic. But the bottom line is that organisms as well as organizations need to utilize their symbiotic partnerships accordingly and rely on them for certain things. And we do this to a certain degree from an organizational standpoint, right? We'll outsource this and we'll partner up with this organization here, but even internally to an organization, there are symbiosis between teams and groups and things of that nature that need to be, really kind of stressed and utilized. So there we have it, right? The four techniques for successful adaptation for natural organisms and organizations. And again, I want to stress that when I'm talking about organisms, I'm also talking about organizations. The same rules apply. The third point here, and this is kind of the third and final major point, is this whole concept of competition and cooperation. Okay, so individual competition, right? So here's a challenge. Here's a small group of individuals, and they are issued a challenge. Within that small group, each of these smaller individuals are now competing with each other initially to come up with a solution for that challenge. That initial competition will lead to cooperation when everybody in that little group realizes and finally kind of like gets that, well, we're all trying to solve the same challenge. So the competition instills cooperation, right? And when then you have cooperation within a small group that then solves a challenge, another group over here made up of smaller individuals will also see that successful challenge met. And then now you have a group of individuals and another group of individuals that for the next challenge, maybe they compete with each other, right? So you go from very small challenges and then cooperation within a small group to then larger challenges and then a competition between groups and then eventually cooperation with the groups, and we can build upon that. We can I'm not going to say easily, but that can be built upon and be essentially become a milestone for, or not a milestone, but a column of your naturally adaptation technique. So here's the quandary, right? And I talked about this a little bit, but because of this business as usual mentality and the successful revenue generation, gross profit for many organizations today, what's the incentive to change? And there's, from a business leader perspective, probably not a lot of incentive to change. So how can we build naturally secured systems in this environment where, and let's be real, incentivized adversaries? Stealing data is a giant business model. Incentivized adversaries are well ahead of the technology, developing the technology to get our data than we are developing technology to prevent that data. So in this environment where there's really not a lot of incentive from a business leader perspective to change the organization, and the business model, even in the face of giant breaches. Anybody know what the latest target stock price is at? It's about where it was before the breach. So we have a short memory. And so in the face of all these giant breaches, it's, the mentality that I'm seeing is that, well, we'll get back to where we were. And so the incentive to change is low. So how can we build more naturally secured systems in this environment? Aren't we as humans very good at adaptation? And yes, of course we are. The irony, right? The irony is we're exceptionally adaptable in certain circumstances, right? And those certain circumstances, tend to be when there are challenges and things of that nature, right? Leaving our comfort zone, we're really good at, these adaptive techniques. But the irony is that, unfortunately, we've created systems that are inherently non-adaptive in our systems and institutions based on this business as usual, we're doing okay, so we don't really need to go out of our comfort zone. And that's where the basis of this inherent challenge lies, right? At the end of the day, that is the problem with the business as usual mentality. So how can we end up with systems that can deal? I'm going to step back for just a second. One of the most important or critical aspects of any organization from a security perspective is the detection and reaction of threats. Okay, lowering or reducing the time that it takes to detect a potential breach and then react to it accordingly is, in my opinion, one of three of the most important things, the other two being data classification and real security awareness, right? Not a SOX checkbox, right? You're laughing, aren't you? So yeah, with those three, right? Here are the basics that I feel any organization can grab onto and begin kind of organically making these subtle changes within your organization, right? These don't have to be big top-down changes that is going to alter the business mindset of a CEO, right? These are little things because little things can compete with each other and then introduce cooperation. And we can, in my opinion, like an organism, we can take our organizations and utilize these same sets of techniques to inherently make our businesses more secure without having to spend lots more money in, next generation firewalls or things of that nature, right? So here we go, right? Introducing the challenges, not directives, right? Without challenges, organizations and organisms don't learn. Learning about solving things is critical from an adaptation perspective. Amplify and reward your successes. Incentivize everything that you possibly can. The physical guard at your plant who successfully doesn't plug in a USB stick when somebody rolls up to the window and says, "Hey, I need to give you my resume. Can you give this to somebody?" When that happens and your guards are like, "No, sir, that's, I can't plug your USB." Incentivize that, reward that person. You have to incentivize the behavior. That ingrains it and everybody thinks about it more, right? Take advantage of local problem solvers, the sharing and distributing of information, that really kind of ties hand in hand with, utilizing the organization's information to either, promote or reduce uncertainty. And promoting the learning, right? Promoting cooperation between groups, between business systems, all of that stuff is critical. So, you ready? A little IT calisthenics. Who here thinks that these behavioral process changes are too radical for your stodgy organization? Raise your hand. Okay. Who here is either in charge of a team, regardless of the size, or in a position of influence in such a team? Raise your hand. Okay. Who here never raises their hand when asked to raise a hand at a talk? Thank you. This is my challenge. This is my challenge to you. Introducing these changes into your small sphere of influence will improve your business unit's metrics, create competition between other units within your organization. That is good. That will lead to cooperation once you realize the goals are the same, leading to group cooperation between business units and business systems. And introduce competition at higher levels. Competition is good. Your small successes will lead to larger successes. And in the end, we are building more naturally secured systems. All without telling the CEO he's doing it wrong. Questions? Google. Google's a great example. Sure. Oh, yeah, no. We incentivize security awareness programs left and right. True security awareness programs where we'll do, let's say, quarterly training, right? But it's you have to kind of rely on PowerPoint to a certain degree, regardless. But the quarterly training is we break it up. This month it's password management, using KeyPass, the benefits of two-factor authentication, why passwords are pretty much an archaic thing, right? And then, when people on their own begin to, see these, let's say, authentication challenges, and then move into applying these types of techniques, that's a rewardable and incentivized type of thing, right? When you talk about, so DevOps, right? DevOps is a great example of where you can apply these, in many different ways. The application development, ensuring that, here's the application goal that we want to achieve. Now, Group A, run with that, and let me, when you have successfully completed that challenge of this part of the application, let's take a look at that. Oh, excellent. You've started development with an understanding of a basic, security framework in terms of the transmission, the storage, et cetera, that type of data. Incentivize that. It's everywhere that you can apply this. And very small, start small, right? Start really small. Did I answer your question? Kind of? Ish? Yes, sir. That's a very good point. Thank you. But I mean, you kind of see where I'm kind of, trying, the point that I'm trying to make, right? Yes, sir. Sure. So what you're saying is that it's business as usual. Well, I mean, getting outside of your personal comfort zone, right? At the end of the day, security is completely subjective to everybody in here, right? And that's because we all have all own our own personal status quo. Okay, what are we willing to invest in XYZ, right? And so security is inherently subjective. So if this is something that you think you can maybe begin applying, right? So how can you kind of step out of that comfort zone that you're in and begin applying these techniques? I'm not sure I can help you. I absolutely agree with that. Yep. And different organizations are going to have different thresholds that you're going to need to kind of figure out, right? As to where where those lines are. You, unfortunately, may be, being a government employee, I'm assuming, or ish, and at least dealing with that may be right there, and I got to kind of like, step out of my comfort zone here. Other organizations, yeah, great. Got all this space over here that I can begin thinking about this. Wolf, did you? Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, one of the organizations that I work very closely with, they routinely go through and will crack their own users' passwords, right? They'll the admins will dump the databases. They'll do, they've got their own GPU cracker, and they'll go through and they'll pop that. Occasionally, they'll find some really bad passwords that still fall acceptable. They're acceptable under the policies, but for the most part, every in that particular organization, department by department, right? They'll go through and say, hey, we're going to do this, let's say quarterly, and so everybody knows that it's going to happen, and everybody whose password either doesn't get broken, or if it does get broken, if it's still a relatively complex-ish type password, here's a $25 Amazon gift card. Thanks, everybody. Right. That's a very simple example, but it really kind of promotes that the behavior, right? Anybody else? Any questions, comments, arguments? I like arguments. Yes, sir.
I work in a software company, so we have application team and the IT team, and I'm the app sales team. And the IT team drives us nuts because we want to do all this stuff that we can't do because it's very many. But we know all of that stuff is out there, and for them, it's just because they do it.
Mm-hmm.
How can we create some sort of initial challenge when you don't have influence over the
So I would say that at a certain point, right, little groups are, in a standard organization, little groups are going to be, let's say, managed by somebody here, right? And then those managers are managed by somebody here. So without understanding the complexity of your actual organization, being able to kind of influence those kind of decision makers with a challenge, right? So, we've been seeing X, and we believe that collectively the organization should begin thinking about how we can mitigate X or improve Y, etc. And again, every organization is going to be different. Every person is going to have a different reaction to that. But being able to utilize the individual members of the group to kind of emphasize, yeah, that's a really good way to we should really start thinking about this. And then at a certain point, in theory, if I'm not, smoking crack, that, at a certain point, that will eventually kind of that challenge communication will wind its way over to here, and now we've got the IT guys thinking about it, and maybe you guys can say, hey, we've been thinking about this too. How can we begin to solve or improve X, Y, Z, etc.? I mean, that's, again, every organization is different, but I've seen that success. Sure. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I definitely agree with that. I completely understand where you're coming from. And that's an unfortunate business as usual mentality, right? You know, a lot of organizations are really siloed. And, you know, I had somebody, you know, I was kind of putting the bits and pieces of this talk together over this past year, and somebody was like, yeah, but my organization, you know, it has these silos and it's really hard. And yeah, I get it, you know, so that's where figuring out what are your limitations of stepping out of the comfort zone come into play. Now, will you specifically be successful? Maybe not, right? I don't know. But, you know, I think this is worthy of, you know, kind of thinking about within any organization and, you know, kind of stopping our reliance on buying shit, you know? Right. Absolutely. That's a great point. Thank you.
I'm working with an organization that is extremely silent. So like the application people want to do something, IT wants to basically get some good. IT wants to do something, application, you know, it's a war zone. But that came from historically. So concept is to go around and work with the people and try and build a relationship. Once you put the relationship, now we can affect it.
Yeah, that's a really great point. You know, if the relationships don't exist between, you know, the different business systems within the organization, then yeah, you're going to have a really tough time trying to, I mean, within your sphere of influence, absolutely. And maybe your actions within your sphere of influence, other organizations that have their, you know, other people that have their own spheres of influence will see that your successes are yielding really interesting results. Maybe you guys got a bonus and they didn't, right? And so, you know, it's that symbiotic relationship that then would then theoretically emerge. Yes, sir. Who's advocating rational behavior? Stop that immediately. No, that's a great point. And, you know, staying, you know, optimistic about all of it, you know, is a necessary variable in my opinion. Absolutely. Yes, sir. I probably not. The question was, is there a reason I used the word rational versus proactive? No, it's probably just that word is probably more prevalent in the source material versus proactive. I mean, we're in InfoSec, we're really, you know, we hear proactive a lot, absolutely. But I would say that, you know, in relation to this talk, you know, it's a interchangeable word. Yes, you can have proactive behavior that is irrational. Thank you. That is true. So he's made my point. Thank you. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much for coming, and have a great rest of the con. Thanks.